I watched through the cracked door as my daughter-in-law, Claire, sat at my late wife's vanity, wearing Elizabeth's vintage silk nightgown and stroking her hair with Elizabeth's silver brush. But the real horror struck when my son entered the room, and she whispered to him in the exact same melodic, haunting tone Elizabeth used to use when we were young, enticing him while surrounded by the relics of a dead woman. It wasn't just a lack of respect. It was a calculated, surgical replacement of a soul, a twisted performance designed to turn my home into a stage for my own psychological collapse. She looked into the mirror, her eyes meeting mine through the reflection for a split second. And she didn't flinch. She smiled, a cold, predatory curve of the lips that told me she knew exactly what she was doing to my heart. The smell of Elizabeth's signature Chanel No. 5 began to drift through the vents of my 19th-century estate, a scent that should have been gone a year ago when she passed away. I am Arthur, a 66-year-old man who spent his life preserving history as a museum curator. But I never realized that the most dangerous artifact in my collection would be the woman my son brought home. Claire was young, sharp, and possessed a terrifying ability to mimic the grace of a generation she never lived through. She didn't just want the mahogany furniture or the priceless oil paintings. She wanted to wear my grief like a garment, until I couldn't tell the difference between the past and the present. Before we dive deeper into how I uncovered her dark past and planned a retribution she never saw coming, please consider subscribing to the channel. I share stories of justice and resilience that you won't want to miss, and your support helps me keep telling them. Every morning, the breakfast table became a minefield of, quote, zero reminders. Claire would prepare the specific lemon zest crepes that Elizabeth only made for our anniversaries, claiming she just, quote, in an old drawer. My son Mark seemed oblivious, or perhaps he was just so desperate for a connection that he allowed himself to be blinded by her charade. But I saw the way she handled the silverware, the way she tilted her head when I walked into a room. It was a perfect, chilling imitation of a woman I had loved for 40 years. She was gaslighting us both, weaving a web of nostalgia and madness, waiting for the moment I would finally break so she could claim the keys to the kingdom. Little did she know, a curator knows how to spot a fake from a mile away. The following week, the atmosphere in the estate shifted from unsettling to outright predatory. I caught Claire in the north wing, a part of the house I had kept locked since the funeral. She wasn't just exploring. She had the skeleton key that used to hang in my study. When I opened the door, she was standing in the center of Elizabeth's walk-in wardrobe, surrounded by decades of history. She had pulled out a heavy, velvet-lined trunk, the one containing the Grand Gala collection. She didn't jump or act guilty when I cleared my throat. Instead, she slowly turned around, holding a string of pearls against her throat. Quote 3, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. The way she said my wife's name felt like a physical blow. She began to walk toward me, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood, mimicking Elizabeth's specific, confident stride. She stopped just inches from me, the scent of that stolen perfume overwhelming my senses. She reached out and straightened my collar, a gesture so intimate and familiar that for a second my brain betrayed me. I felt a surge of grief so sharp it nearly brought me to my knees. She saw that flicker of weakness in my eyes, and her smile widened. It wasn't the smile of a daughter-in-law. It was the look of a conqueror who had just breached the city walls. Later that evening, I found the lock on my private desk had been tampered with. She wasn't just looking for jewelry anymore. She was hunting for the deed to the estate and the ledger of my antique holdings. She was systematic, moving through my life like a ghost, reclaiming a haunting ground. I realized then that she wasn't just playing dress-up. She was studying me, testing my reactions, and preparing for something much larger. She wanted me to see her as a reincarnation, a second chance at love, or a reason to finally let go of my grip on the family fortune. But as I watched her from the shadows of the hallway, I felt a cold resolve hardening in my chest. If she wanted to play with the dead, I was going to make sure she felt the full weight of the past. The shadows in the mansion grew longer that winter, and Claire's performance became terrifyingly bold. One rainy Tuesday, the power flickered and died, plunging the estate into a thick, suffocating darkness. I made my way toward the kitchen for a flashlight, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw a faint glow coming from the dining hall. There, under the dim light of a few flickering candles, sat Claire. She was wearing the emerald silk dress Elizabeth had worn on our 25th anniversary. Her back was to me, and she was humming a melody, a private lullaby Elizabeth only sang when she thought no one was listening. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Elizabeth?" I whispered, the word escaping my lips before I could stop it. Claire turned slowly, her face partially obscured by the shadows, and for a terrifying second, the resemblance was absolute. "I'm here, Arthur," she breathed, her voice a perfect, haunting echo of my late wife's soft rasp. "I never really left you." She stood up and glided toward me, her hand reaching out to touch my cheek. Her skin was cold, and her eyes were wide, locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. She didn't break character for even a heartbeat. She was testing the limits of my sanity, trying to see if she could make me believe in a ghost. I pulled away, my hands trembling. I saw a flash of irritation cross her face, a momentary crack in the mask, before she reverted to that eerie, serene expression. She murmured. I retreated to my room and locked the door, leaning against it until my breathing slowed. It wasn't just about the money anymore. She was trying to overwrite my memories, to colonize my very mind. She wanted me to doubt my own senses, so that when the time came, I would sign whatever papers she put in front of me, just to make the confusion stop. But as I sat there in the dark, I realized she had made a fatal mistake. By trying to become Elizabeth, she had forced me to remember exactly how sharp and observant my wife actually was. And I was going to use every bit of that sharpness to tear her world apart. The following morning, I overheard a conversation that chilled me to the bone. I was standing in the library when I heard Claire's voice coming from the sunroom. She wasn't using the soft, melodic tone of my late wife anymore. Her voice was sharp, clinical, and dripping with false concern as she spoke to my son, Mark. She whispered, though she made sure her voice carried just enough for me to hear. I heard Mark sigh, a sound of pure exhaustion. Claire continued, quote, "She was gaslighting him, painting me as a senile old man who was a danger to himself. It was a brilliant, albeit disgusting move. By positioning herself as the 13th of my delusions, she was forcing Mark to choose between his father's freedom and his wife's comfort. Later that day, she brought a family doctor over for, quote, 14. Throughout the entire visit, Claire acted like a saint, gently correcting me when I spoke and touching my hand with a pitying look every time I stayed silent. She was setting the stage for a legal takeover, creating a trail of witnesses who would swear I had lost my grip on reality. I played along. I let my hand shake when I held the teacup. I stared blankly at the wall for moments at a time. I wanted her to feel confident. I wanted her to believe she was winning. While she was busy whispering in Mark's ear about, quote, 15, I was making my own moves. I had already contacted a private investigator to look into her life before she met my son. If she wanted to play a role in my family's history, I was going to make sure I knew every single chapter of her own dark past. The hunt had officially begun. The private investigator didn't take long to find the rot beneath Claire's polished surface. He met me at a secluded park, handing over a thick manila envelope that felt heavier than lead. Inside were old newspaper clippings, grainy digital photos, and legal documents from 3 different states. My daughter-in-law wasn't just a gold digger. She was a professional predator. Her real name wasn't even Claire. 10 years ago, she was an aspiring actress named Elena, who had failed to make it in Hollywood, but found a much more lucrative stage in the homes of wealthy, grieving widowers. The pattern was identical every time. She would find a man shattered by loss, study his late wife's life through social media and old photos, and then slowly become her. She had done this to a retired judge in Virginia and a tech mogul in Seattle. Both men had ended up in high-end nursing homes, their estates liquidated and their children alienated, while Claire vanished with millions. But there was a darker detail that the newspapers only hinted at. In her wake, she left families destroyed, but she also left a trail of mysterious jewelry thefts and forged wills. She was a chameleon who didn't just steal money. She stole the very memory of the women she replaced. One clipping showed her leaving a courthouse in a large sun hat, a smirk on her face that I recognized all too well. She had never been caught because she was careful to make her victims look insane before she struck. I sat in my study that night, the documents spread out on my desk. I felt a cold, sharp clarity I hadn't felt since Elizabeth died. Claire thought I was her next paycheck, another old man to be tucked away in a padded room while she sipped wine in my wife's garden. She didn't realize that as a curator, I knew how to handle fragile things, and how to crush them if they were fakes. I wasn't going to call the police yet. A woman like her would just slip away and find a new victim. No, I wanted her to feel the same walls closing in that she had built for me. I wanted her to see the ghosts of everyone she had stepped on. The next morning, I decided to give Claire exactly what she wanted: a front row seat to my collapse. I sat in the garden, staring blankly at a dead rosebush until I heard her footsteps. When she sat beside me, I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked at her with misty eyes and whispered. I saw the predatory spark in her eyes, the thrill of the kill. She leaned in, her voice like honey. This was her moment. She believed she had finally broken my spirit and replaced my wife in my mind. I said, my voice trembling with fake emotion. Later that day, I led her to the safe and opened it. Her breath hitched as she saw the velvet boxes. Inside were shimmering necklaces and rings that looked like they belonged in a royal treasury. She ran her fingers over the stones, her face contorted with pure, unadulterated greed. She didn't realize that as an antique dealer, I had connections to the best counterfeiters in the country. These were high-quality glass and plated lead, worth less than the boxes they sat in. "These are yours now," I murmured. "But we must celebrate. I want to throw a grand dinner party next weekend. I want the world to see you in Elizabeth's finest gown, wearing these jewels. We will show everyone that our family is stronger than ever." She hugged me then, and for a second I felt the coldness of her heart pressing against mine. She thought she was hugging a fool who had just handed her his life. In reality, she was hugging the man who was building her gallows, one diamond at a time. The days leading up to the dinner party were a masterclass in deception. Claire was practically glowing, her confidence reaching a fever pitch. She spent hours in front of the mirrors, practicing her Elizabeth smile, and draped in the fake diamonds I had given her. She was so blinded by the sparkle of the glass that she didn't notice me making dozens of private phone calls from the garden shed. One afternoon, she walked into my study with a stack of legal documents. She said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. She leaned over the desk, her perfume, my wife's perfume, filling the air. She placed a pen in my hand, her eyes locked on mine, waiting for the final victory. I looked at the papers. They were a death warrant for my independence. If I signed these, She could commit me to an asylum the very next morning and sell the roof over my head. I whispered, using her game against her. I signed the name Arthur with a flourish, but I made sure to use a special disappearing ink I had acquired years ago for an exhibit on wartime espionage. In 6 hours, the signature would vanish, leaving the paper as blank as her soul. She snatched the papers away, her hand trembling with excitement. She promised, kissing my cheek. The coldness of her lips made my skin crawl. As she hurried out to the documents, I began finalizing the guest list. I wasn't just inviting our old bridge partners and neighbors. I had spent the last 3 days tracking down the people who had been erased from the lives of her previous victims. I found a daughter in Seattle and a son in Virginia, people who had lost everything to the woman they knew as Elena. I offered them first-class tickets and a chance for a very specific kind of justice. The stage was set, the props were in place, and the lead actress had no idea that the script had been rewritten. I spent the next 2 days away from the estate, telling Mark and Claire that I was visiting an old colleague to discuss the sale of some antiques. In reality, I was sitting in a quiet hotel lounge, meeting the ghosts of Claire's past. First, there was David, a man in his 40s from Virginia, whose father, a retired judge, had died in a state-run facility after a woman named Elena stripped him of his dignity and his home. Then came Sarah from Seattle, whose family inheritance had vanished into offshore accounts before she could even say goodbye to her dying father. As we sat together, the air in the room grew heavy with shared grief and a burning desire for justice. They showed me photos of the woman they knew, Claire, but with different hair, different names, yet the same predatory eyes. When I showed them a recent photo of her in my wife's emerald dress, Sarah gasped, her knuckles turning white. Quote, 35, she whispered. We weren't just a group of strangers anymore. We were a collective of her victims, ready to strike back. I explained the plan. I didn't want a quiet arrest in a back alley. I wanted her to be exposed in the very moment she felt most powerful. I wanted her to see their faces when she thought she had finally achieved her ultimate prize. I told them. They agreed, without hesitation. Returning to the mansion, I found Claire in the ballroom, supervising the caterers. She was acting like the queen of the castle, snapping her fingers at the staff and demanding the finest crystal. She looked at me and smirked, believing I was just a shell of a man waiting for the end. I simply smiled back, a genuine, terrifyingly calm smile. I said, I walked to my study, feeling the weight of the disappearing ink pen in my pocket. The trap was set, the guests were arriving, and for the first time in a year, I felt like Elizabeth was right there beside me, cheering me on. The night of the dinner was a masterpiece of tension. Claire descended the staircase in Elizabeth's emerald silk, the fake diamonds catching the light of the chandeliers. She moved with a practiced, haunting grace, playing the role of the devoted daughter-in-law to perfection. My son Mark stood beside her, looking confused but relieved to see, quote, 40 restored. But as the guests were seated, the atmosphere began to change. I stood up at the head of the table, my glass raised. I announced, my voice steady and cold as steel. On cue, David and Sarah stood up from the far end of the table. The color drained from Claire's face instantly. Her mask didn't just crack, it shattered. "Elena?" David asked, his voice echoing through the silent room. "I believe you have some of my father's property." Sarah stepped forward, holding a photo of her own late father. The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire tried to laugh it off, tried to turn to Mark for support, but I placed a folder on the table, the investigator's report, with her real face and real crimes laid bare. I whispered so only she could hear. When the police entered through the side doors, Claire didn't fight. She looked around at the room full of people she had tried to erase, and for the first time, She looked exactly like what she was, a ghost caught in the light. The aftermath of the dinner party felt like the first deep breath I had taken in years. As the police led Claire away, still dressed in my wife's gown, but looking smaller and more pathetic than I ever thought possible, the mansion fell into a profound, peaceful silence. My son, Mark, sat on the grand staircase with his head in his hands. The realization of how close he had come to losing everything, and how he had been manipulated into doubting his own father, hit him like a physical blow. We didn't talk much that night. Some things are too heavy for words, but the look of shared understanding in our eyes was a start. I didn't keep the estate. To me, it had become a museum of shadows, and it was time for a living man to step out of the dark. I sold the house and the vast majority of the antique collection, ensuring that a significant portion of the proceeds went to David, Sarah, and the other families Claire had defrauded. It wasn't just about the money for them. It was about the acknowledgement that their pain was real, and that justice, however late, had finally arrived. I used the rest of the funds to buy a modest cottage by the coast and to travel. I've spent the last few months seeing the world through my own eyes, not through the lens of a curator or a widower. I've started painting again, a hobby I gave up decades ago. Sometimes I catch the scent of the sea air and realize it smells better than any bottled perfume ever could. I'm 66, and for the first time in my life, I'm not looking back at history. I'm looking forward to tomorrow. Looking back at the cold, calculated way I trapped her, I sometimes wonder about the morality of it all. I played a dangerous game with my own sanity and the memory of the woman I loved to catch a predator who thought I was nothing but a paycheck. Do you think I went too far by using her own tactics against her? Or was this the only way to truly stop a woman who had mastered the art of destroying families? What would you have done if you found a stranger wearing your loved one's soul like a costume? If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please hit the like button and leave a comment with your thoughts. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another thrilling tale of revenge and resilience. The end. Thank you for listening.